Hello, my name is Dr. Stephen Owens, and I'm a Senior Education Policy Analyst at the Georgia Budget and Policy Institute. This is a download of all that happened, maybe not everything, but a lot that happened around education policy during Georgia's General Assembly this year, with a specific emphasis on the budget, because at GBPI, that is a huge part of what I do, is that we believe that the budget is a moral document, and we want to expand economic opportunities for more Georgians. My work at GBPI also will continue. The reason I'm doing this is because we are a part of Fund Georgia's Future, which is a new coalition that's fighting for a just education system with fair and full funding. And you can see some of the commitments that we believe are required in order for a state to have those things, including inclusivity. We believe that everyone needs to be involved, specifically those folks who've been traditionally kept out of education policy and funding decisions in the past, committing to acknowledging and dismantling historical systems of marginalization in education. Only the sick know to go to the doctor. We have to be able to name the barriers that are put in place for people based on race, gender identity, sexual orientation, language proficiency, ability, so that we can begin to take them apart. And under full funding, we believe that we need to maintain the system to make sure that it aligns with the needs of the students and allow it to grow based on the expectations we have for these students. If you want to learn more about Fund Georgia's Future, you can go to our website right there, fundgeorgiasfuture.com, or follow us on Twitter or Facebook. There's also the ability to apply to join, and we would love anyone who is interested in the welfare of public education to please consider joining Fund Georgia's Future. Okay, when the Georgia General Assembly meets, it's for 40 days, starting in early January and concludes usually early April, but there's a lot of leeway there. They have just one responsibility in these 40 days, and it is to pass a balanced budget. But you actually pass two budgets. You amend the current year budget, which is, we are currently in fiscal year 22. I know it says fiscal year 23 up there, but it's the amended fiscal year 22 budget. And then you propose a brand new budget called the big budget that will start July 1st. And so that's the fiscal 23 budget. We're currently in fiscal 22 budget. And so we're going to talk about that amended budget real quick before we move on to the next big budget. It's important to know here, changes made to the amended budget are really just like these one-time changes. It does not shift the entire budget moving forward. If you make changes to the big budget, then anything you add in the big budget would have to be taken out in future budgets. That's not true of the amended, but that is true of the big budget. So, looking at the amended budget, again, this is the budget that we're currently operating right now, that schools are currently operating on. The governor proposed that we get rid of the current budget cuts. Schools are operating under this $383 million budget cut that was passed in last year's General Assembly. This fills in those funds that were cut. Now, this is a little tricky because school district budgets were passed with the assumption of this budget cut. So, I mean, it's a good thing. It's absolutely a good thing to have this additional funding put into school budgets. But if a teacher was fired because the schools thought they were having a budget cut last year, they remain fired. It's not like you're fired conditional on whether or not the amended budget passes. So again, this is much better than making a cut in the amended budget or continuing these budget cuts. But either way, this kind of fills in last year's budget cuts and hopefully puts an end to what had been a pattern of consistently cutting funds to public schools. Give you an idea, over the last 21 years, if this budget cut, I should point over here, if this budget cut had been in effect, that would mean the state had cumulatively cut $10 billion from public schools over those 20 years. This cut won't happen, thankfully, because this addition in the amended. But that means that just over those last 20 years, that $9.6 billion was cut from Georgia's public schools. Better than it not happening, to fill this in and hopefully done with these specific budget cuts forever. About $315 million was added in for these one-time bonuses for full-time employees and $1,000 bonuses for half-time employees. It's important to note, just because the state gives money to schools for this purpose, it does not mean that schools have to do this. If you have a lot of needs in your school system and the state is giving you a few $1 million to give pay raises, you are completely within your rights as a budget writer to have that money go to these other needs, and not give these pay raises to teachers. We saw that with the last teacher pay raise a few years ago, and I'm going to talk just a little bit more why it's even bigger than that. But so if you are in a school system and your district has gotten this money, but you haven't seen a $2,000 pay raise, that doesn't mean it's necessarily not coming, but I'm saying that there's nothing that compels school districts to give you this $2,000 raise if you're a full-time employee. $188 million was added for school bus replacement. Now this is great because the amount of funding for school buses and school transportation has gone practically unchanged since the Clinton administration, fiscal year 2000. This does not fundamentally change that formula, but we have school districts really suffering because since 2000, the state has gained 250,000 students. The price of diesel, the price of buses, the price of labor, all these things have increased, but the state's commitment has not increased. It's actually decreased. When you consider that in the wake of the Great Recession, state passed a law saying we're no longer going to cover the health insurance for school bus drivers. And so now districts cover that health insurance. So the amount the districts have had to cover have increased. And if you can't afford to pay your bus drivers a living wage, if your buses aren't starting, you can't just say like, oh, that's too bad for kids. You got to pull that money from somewhere. So where do you pull it? We know that 70 cents of every dollar spent in Georgia public schools is directly in the classroom in salaries and benefits. So by choosing to let this one area languish, the state is essentially ensuring larger class sizes for our children, ensuring fewer accommodations for kids. We can't think of schools as kind of piecemeal buffet style if budget writers also can't think of it that way. And so I'm glad for this one-time infusion of funds. We need to make structural changes to the way that we fund student transportation so that we can make sure our kids are riding on safe buses, make sure that people who drive and monitor them are paid a living wage. $37 million is a combination of a few different line items. This will be a $1,000 salary bonus for nutrition workers, custodians, nurses, transportation workers. This is great. This is a good first step for these folks, usually lower income folks inside the school. There are as many people working in the school. We're going to make sure that school is safe and clean, and that your children are well taken care of. There are as many who are not teachers as there are teachers. There's just a ton of people that it takes to make a school run well. We need to do right by all of them, including the teachers for sure. And then throughout the budget, you'll see this $5,000 pay increase for state employees. That would be folks at the Department of Education. You're going to see it in a lot of different areas, but I wanted to mention that as, they're also working to make sure that we have the highest quality education for our kids. So that's the amended budget. Now let's look at the big budget. What is the budget that will start July 1st of this year, fiscal year 23? You'll see that an additional $383 million. That means that there will be no budget cut moving forward, no dedicated budget cut moving forward in public education. I want to be clear. This does not mean that our schools have everything they need. It just means that we're not actively cutting funds from the budget. And so while I want to celebrate an additional $383 million put into Georgia's schools. This is the amount the law says is needed for a quality basic education. To celebrate saying, like, we did it. We fully funded public schools. I feel like that's me celebrating that I didn't, I don't know, cheat on my wife this year. Like, that's better than not funding. But I don't know how worthy of celebration this is. This really is just like the minimum that's required to educate our schools. I'm glad that this money was put in, but this is not the same as providing an adequate public education for all kids. So I will just leave it there. This is the minimum amount that has been met. We're not actively cutting funds in this area to public schools. An additional line item there, you'll see $287 million for teacher pay raises. When Governor Brian Kemp was running for governor, a campaign promise of his was to raise teacher pay by $5,000 per teacher. The first year, he and the General Assembly were able to deliver on $3,000 of that raise. This would represent the remaining $2,000 of that raise. I'm showing you the date that it takes effect because it's a small thing, but it matters to those of us who follow the budget. This does not take effect until September 1st, 2022. But the budget starts July 1st, 2022. So this first year will not be a $2,000 pay raise. It'll be a $1,666 raise, 67 cents repeating. So that means one of two things. Either teachers this next year won't get a $2,000 pay raise, they'll get a $1,700 pay raise. Or the second, schools that want to make sure teachers get this raise that they're told they're going to get, at the dollar amount that they're told they're going to get, will need to find that money somewhere else. But it goes deeper than that. Because the state does not pay for all teachers. The state only funds about half of all the funds for school. Local property taxes take the bulk of the remaining, and then federal funds 7 to 10%. So when the state says we're going to raise teacher pay by $2,000 for all teachers, but the state only pays for 50% of teachers, if you want to raise pay for the other half of teachers that you have in the school building, then again, you need to find that money somewhere else. Find it in your local property taxes. So some school districts might not give all teachers a $2,000 pay raise. They might run the numbers and say, like, we don't have enough money to give everyone a $2,000 teacher pay raise. There will be significant pressure, and I think good pressure, to make sure that all schools raise teacher pay by $2,000, but it doesn't mean I necessarily think it will. So we'll follow that. At GUPI, we do a survey every summer to see what issues folks that are writing the budgets have in public education. And so we'll ask about this. Do you plan to give a $2,000 teacher pay raise? Even as we recognize that schools have a lot of needs, they have more needs than resources. So I'm not blaming districts that have to make this terrible choice, but letting you know that, like, this is the position we put our schools in regularly. These next two line items for local 5 mil share and equalization are a little wonky. Local 5 mil share is a stand-in for how much your district can raise to pay for public education. So this in Georgia constitutional law, local districts have to pay part of the bill for public education. It's how much you tax to pay for public education. And local 5 mil share, this is a formula. This isn't necessarily a choice made each year by lawmakers. They really are just kind of following this formula. And the fact that we're paying less, the state's paying less into local 5 mil share by $142 million, means that property tax collection has increased on average statewide. So that doesn't surprise a lot of people when you see what the housing market has been for the past couple of years. This is what this means, is that local districts have been able to raise more money on their own, need less money from the state based on the formula. Equalization, now this is the really unique one to me at least. Equalization is this formula we sit on top of how much we provide to schools in this formula to try to equalize between low wealth school districts and high wealth school districts. The top story for equalization, the fact that we're paying less in equalization, means not only are property taxes increasing statewide, but they're actually increasing faster in our low wealth districts than in our high wealth districts. It's the first time I've seen this happen in equalization in a number of years that I've been following the budget. Again, the headline here is that people's properties are increasing in value. We're getting more tax revenue from that. And actually, the state has gotten a little fairer as far as that property tax collection between our low wealth districts and our high wealth districts. Again, it's the first time I've seen that happen as I've been following the budget. Then we have this $44 million for student enrollment growth and training experience. Public schools lost a lot of kids during the beginning of the pandemic. In the second year of the pandemic, a lot of these children came back into the public school system, and reflects that. That's a formula addition. And then $6.3 million for pupil transportation employees to get 5.4% raises. I added that again because this is a focus of ours, is that we look out for those employees in the school who traditionally have been kept out of the largesse of the state. I hope I used that word correctly. And then I have here in italics, GNET's drama. This is the Georgia Network for Educational Therapeutic Services. It is for folks with multiple disabilities in K through 12. As I understand it, Georgia is unique nationwide in the fact that we have separate facilities, specifically when you consider the depth of special education research that says that children should be taught in the least restrictive environment and next to their peers, regardless of ability. That should be the ideal situation. GNETS has been sued by the federal government for the quality of some of these facilities. That lawsuit is ongoing. And during General Assembly, the chairman of Senate Appropriations essentially just got rid of GNETS funding and moved it into a different part of the budget, saying that, like, okay, this will help this one portion of that lawsuit. And we're talking on the final day of budget negotiations. Like, this budget has to be passed in like 2 hours. And this kind of came out that this is what the Senate was doing, that they were debating on what to do with GNETS funding. Long story short, after meeting between the House and the Senate in what's called conference committee, where they disagree on a bill and they come together, a few representatives from each house come together and say, like, okay, what are we going to say is the final proposal? They decided to kind of keep GNETS funding where it is, with promises to study it moving forward. Suffice it to say, this was a huge concern for school district leaders, for people in the education space, of like, okay, are we going to have the funding necessary to educate these students, regardless of where you stand on whether or not GNETS is the right way to educate these students. One of the things that I spent a lot of time advocating against this session is vouchers. This is public funds for private schools. Over the past 15 years, the state of Georgia has funneled over $1 billion of public funds to private schools through a couple different avenues. And you can see all the bills that we dealt with this year to try to expand or create new avenues or expand existing avenues. Most of these bills died, but House Bill 517, this is interesting because last year, the Georgia Department of Audits and Accounts took a look at one of our vouchers, it's a tax credit voucher, saying instead of paying state taxes, you can write a portion of that to a tax haven, and then that third party will pay private school tuition for some folks. We have no idea where this money's going. It's $100 million a year. We have no idea if this money's going. We don't know if these individual scholarship granting organizations are just doing the bare minimum and then putting the rest of the money in the stock market and getting rich off returns. The amount of money they get from returns doesn't have to be used on private school vouchers, which is pretty rare compared to other states. So is this just like a money laundering operation? We have no idea. And the bill was written that way to give the people of Georgia zero accountability for these public funds. And so the Department of Audits and Accounts looked at this, noticed that there were opportunities for mismanagement, fraud. We've seen fraud in these programs in other states. So wrote this large audit saying, here are the changes you need to make, blah, 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 lists them all out. Last year, House Bill 517 was written saying, like, okay, we'll start providing some of these, and we're talking really base level transparency issues. What can these groups do with this money? Who's actually making use of these funds? It was really base level transparency or accountability. And then this year, so House Bill 517 last year passed both chambers, but there are changes within, so it didn't make it all the way to the governor. This year, as they took it back up, because we were in year 2 of a 2-year session, the House just made an amendment saying we'll also increase the amount of funding that goes to these private schools by an additional $100 million every year once fully implemented. You don't have to be some sort of math genius to know that's $1 billion over 10 years in additional funds to private schools where we have just like zero understanding where the money's going, how the kids are doing once they go there. Is the money going to schools that kick you out because you're gay or because you're not the preferred religion? We just don't know. House Bill 517 had that amendment in the House. It passed, went to the Senate. Senate disagreed. Either way, in conference committee, they decided they had to compromise down to just $20 million a year. It's still $20 million more than I think needs to go into a program like this. But I would say a big win for advocates of high quality public education everywhere, because at GBPI, we are clear-eyed about the harms of public education to students, specifically students who've traditionally been marginalized based on race, income, ability, etc. But we do not believe the way to solve discrimination is to set up and fund a separate discriminatory system of education. And that's why we will continue to oppose private school vouchers like the ones that the General Assembly tried to pass this year. But when you consider all the bills that were proposed, all the money that could have flowed to these schools, the fact that only one of these bills passed and the only way they could get it to pass was not have it go through committee, but to have it via amendments, I'm saying that's a win. I'm counting this as a win for advocates of high quality education for all children. What's something that didn't pass? This is a pet project of mine. I think we're starting to see additional movement on this, but I'm personally very frustrated. Georgia is one of only 6 states in the union that does not provide additional funding to educate students living in poverty. When you think about the way that we set up public education funding, at least in Georgia, there's this recognition that some kids have unique needs. And so kids who are falling behind in grade level, once that's proven, then they can get additional funding for smaller class sizes. Students with disabilities have these needs for accommodations for smaller class sizes, and it's written into the formula. We have all these different program rates for these kids based on need, but we are not recognizing the number one need that school leaders continue to tell us about, that the research continues to tell us about, which is the difference in a child's education based on the income of the parents. So Georgia continues to ignore this group of students when we have one of the highest child poverty rates in the nation. So if you look at our test scores, the difference in how kids perform that are on free and reduced lunch compared to their wealthier peers, it's the second largest, you can call it a gap, you can call it a difference. It's the second largest difference in the entire United States. If we could do right by these kids, Georgia would have a world-class public education system. And I really mean that. But we continue to ignore these. And House Bill 10, which I was really hoping would get a hearing this year, didn't really move anywhere. We will try again next year. But of course, the budget was not everything that happened this year. Lawmakers filed 4 bills, which came in this wave of, we can call it anti-CRT hysteria. I'm putting that in quotes because critical race theory is a complex legal theory that is not taught in K through 12 schools, but folks, let's say, I can be kind and say they're concerned about the outsized role that race and racism was having in classroom discussions. I believe that when you see how folks responded to things like diversity and equity inclusion, like social emotional learning, so many things got wrapped into anti-CRT. It was hard not to see this as a backlash to a national discussion around the role of race and racism in America, specifically after George Floyd's murder. When you consider that all of these bills borrow from President Trump's executive order saying these are all the things that shouldn't be taught in public schools, it is hard not to see this as a response to increased Black authority and the authority and experiences of people of color. Each one of these bills has a similar formula. You list out all these concepts schools are not allowed to teach. For instance, the United States is systematically racist. Then you say, but it shouldn't stop schools from having difficult conversations about, let's say, the Trail of Tears, enslavement of folks. But if you are found guilty of teaching one of these concepts after this due process system that's built into each one of these bills, then you will be punished via A, B, or C. And each one of the bills had different punishments. The one that passed, that's waiting on the governor's signature, essentially puts the school district on probation. You lose some of the freedoms that the state has given schools on how to operate public education. And so this was something that has got a lot of attention over the past few months. What was not expected was how at the 11th hour, there was language in a bill that was not going anywhere, that would ban transgender girls from playing in sports. That bill was not going to pass on the last day of session, called Sine Die. Some of the language was pulled from that bill and put into House Bill 1084 and then passed. So the final version of this bill bans divisive concepts. It bans divisive concepts. Let me put the quotes in the right spot. But also has language that allows the organization that manages high school sports, Georgia High Schools Associations, to make the decision on whether or not to ban these students from playing sports, ban these trans girls specifically from playing in sports. It was hard to watch. It is hard to process right now. The cruelty of such an act, even apart from that cruelty, the fact that the Georgia General Assembly delegated the responsibility for such an action to a unaccountable nonprofit, it's hard to see what that could look like in future policies. Are there other nonprofits that are now going to be given such wide, deep authority? We'll see. Maybe the state will take over the Georgia High School Association and provide some governance over it. But as of now, that is a very unique and I'll say dangerous way to legislate, to allow an unaccountable nonprofit to make a decision like that that could really negatively affect children across our state. This was the session of education policy bills. And so the ones that I mentioned were not the only ones. House Bill 1178, Parents' Bill of Rights. This is pulling together some rights that parents had in other parts of code, putting them together in one piece of code and saying, all right, these are all the things that parents can have if you're a supporter of this bill, you say like, oh, finally, we have the transparency we need. Opponents, which include a lot of partners of GBPI that I work with, said this creates an overly antagonistic relationship between teachers and parents that could be solved with a conversation, but it passed regardless. House Bill 1283 is a bill that would require recess for elementary school students. Some school districts, at least I know about one, do not allow, they allow individual teachers to make the decision on whether or not there's recess at all. It's not just like, oh, if the teacher is too busy or they all have too much stuff on your plate. It's whether or not there's recess at all. And so 1283, if it's signed by the governor, would require recess for elementary school students. Senate Bill 226, it's kind of a surprise to me, but this allows a process to begin challenging library books. There was some talk earlier in session that maybe this bill around online media and schools relegating what kids can access online, maybe that would be the book burning bill this year, but Senate Bill 226 passed, is waiting on the governor, which would actually challenge library books. It's hard to see a process like this get started in Georgia in 2022, specifically because we've seen how this has been weaponized in other states against specifically Black and trans authors, Black and queer authors rather. And so we'll see what that looks like if the governor signs it. Senate Bill 514 would prohibit mask mandates for the next 5 years. This is law. Schools cannot mandate masks and have to allow parents to opt their children out for any reason whatsoever. So school mask mandates are dead in Georgia for the next 5 years. And then House Bill 1435, this is kind of an exciting one because a colleague of mine worked so hard. That Georgia does not have needs-based aid. We're one of only 2 states in the union that doesn't have needs-based aid for colleges. This is kind of a version of that to help folks who are struggling in what they're calling the financial gap, who are close to completing college but don't have the financial support they need for one reason or another. And this provides about $10 million for this program. And so that's a huge win in higher education for low-income students specifically. Some more bills that passed. Senate Bill 588 ironically passed with 0 public input allowed in both chambers committee meetings. The irony of not allowing public comment when you are now going to force school boards to have public comment every time. If someone is kicked out of a school board meeting, they can appeal and come back the next week. This feels particularly targeted towards our largest school district, Gwinnett, which has had a lot of difficulty with parents showing up and demanding that critical race theory not be taught or to be mad about mask mandates. So we'll see what that looks like for our public servants moving forward. Senate Bill 345 eliminates schools' ability to require COVID vaccinations. Some bills that failed. This is that student technology bill that I talked about. Which would require a level of filters in the school's internet. That failed. Another bill that I really liked, I'm surprised it failed. In Georgia, if you receive a needs development rating on your teacher evaluation, if you get that twice in 5 years, you can lose your teacher's license. There's a level below needs development, of course, but people brought up in hearings, like if someone needs development, they actually need support. It doesn't mean that they need to be fired for getting this twice in half a decade. So it removes the penalty for that with hopes that we set up a system that actually supports teachers that need development and not just punishes them, and it did not pass. Here's some resolutions. These usually set up study committees over the summer. One, HR 650 creates literacy instruction study committee. I think the folks that helped push this across the finish line want Georgia to adopt the science of reading, whole language supports. We shall see. Lawmakers made it clear that they don't want just like one curriculum to come out of this, even though I think the proponents for this bill do want one curriculum and one way to teach reading to come out of this, because we've seen how states like Florida, Mississippi have significantly increased childhood literacy rates by applying the science of reading. We'll see what that comes out of that. Senate Resolution 650, this is going to review education funding over the summer with 5 senators. The chairman of Senate Appropriations is on it, as well as a few others. I hope GBPI, Fund Georgia's Future, the groups that I'm a part of, I hope we can be active in this space to support the lawmakers as they come up with their recommendations. I'm hoping this is a good faith attempt to actually see how we can do right by all kids, and not just a way to say, like, okay, how can we save money? Because I'm of the mind that there are very few statewide areas that we could cut funding to public schools without this large negative effect on children. So hopefully we can enter into those discussions this summer. And Senate Resolution 802, this is part of that banning trans students legislation. This is a study committee to review the Georgia High Schools Association. Unclear if this is just reviewing GHSA's ability to ban trans students from sports, or if this is about other complaints that lawmakers have had around GHSA, specifically how much schools have to travel for high school football. Why is my school in this classification? It should be 3A. Why do you have us classified as 2A, etc. There were a bill and a resolution that failed that I was really surprised by. This would provide some criteria for how we accredit schools in Georgia. That's Senate Bill 498 would say, here's what accreditation agencies, here's how they should evaluate school performance. Because you can't get Hope Scholarship, you can't get into a lot of colleges if your school is not accredited. But there's been some drama in one of Georgia's largest counties where school board members have been so opaque about the decision-making process, specifically around funding, and around a few other policy decisions, that the accrediting agency took a look at it and said, like, yeah, you're right. This is not best practice, and wrote this kind of scathing review that bothered some folks that support those members of the school board in Cobb. So they passed this law saying, like, no, quit punishing schools because of a few school board members. And I've seen people on both sides of the aisle say, no, we need to have a real healthy conversation about this, because, yeah, you do not want your school district to lose accreditation because of 1 or 2 school board members. And that bill, which would have provided some guidelines for accrediting agency, failed. And then the House Study Committee, House Resolution 1048, also failed. So we'll see if there's any movement on that moving forward. It could be like kind of a committee, individual committee, study committee. We'll see about that. That is it. I mean, it's not it, but that is the best I can do in under 40 minutes to give you an update of what happened this session around Georgia education policy. It doesn't mean that this is the end. It just means that no other bills can be made into law until January of next year. And while I could say I'm eager for the next session, I'm really not. It took a lot out of me, and I'm glad it's over. You're probably glad this video is over.